When Clara's father remarries a beautiful, enigmatic widow, the once gentle halls of Greystone Manor begin to whisper with secrets. Servants vanish, mirrors murmur in the dark, and the old rose garden, locked and overgrown, hums with a life of its own. As the blood moon approaches, Clara discovers that her wicked stepmother isn't just cruel. She's ancient, cursed, and has plans for Clara's blood. But the roses remember. And so does the dead. Hello family, welcome to Storytime with Imzi. Please subscribe and like, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. Rain fell like whispered secrets across the stone terraces of Greystone Manor. The skies had wept for days, as if mourning with Clara the absence that had hollowed every corridor. Her mother, Lady Alira, was gone. It had been 6 months, yet the grief still clung to the tapestries and candle smoke like dust never swept. Clara stood at the top of the grand staircase, her small hands clutching the carved banister, watching as the new lady of the manor stepped through the heavy oak doors. Lady Verena. She wore no black for the widow's house she entered, only a deep emerald velvet that shimmered like the skin of serpents. Her gloved hands never once touched the banisters, her boots never made a sound. She seemed to glide rather than walk. Behind her came a perfume of something floral but off, roses laced with something bitter, almost metallic. Lord Arlen, Clara's father, looked smaller beside his new wife, though he tried to wear the smile of a man who had chosen love again. "This is your new mother, Clara," he said, gesturing awkwardly. Clara did not step forward. She felt the weight of Verena's eyes before their gazes met, eyes the color of wet ash, smiling lips that didn't quite reach them. "Such a delicate thing," Verena murmured, crouching to Clara's level with a feline grace. "You must be terribly lonely in such a vast home." Her voice was silken, but her eyes flicked to the ring on Clara's hand, her mother's ring. Clara said nothing. She did not flinch when Verena reached to touch her cheek, but something in her belly curled like a dry leaf in flame. Later that evening, the servants whispered as they unpacked Verena's belongings. So many trunks, some locked with brass clasps shaped like talons. A mirror taller than any man, covered in black cloth, was carried into the west wing, once Clara's mother's quarters. Clara had wanted to protest, to tell her father those rooms should remain untouched. But he no longer listened quite the same. He smiled often now, but rarely at her, as if grief had erased the language they once spoke in looks and laughter. That night, the manor grew colder, though no doors were open. The shadows pressed a little deeper into the corners. And Clara, lying beneath her quilts, heard the soft click of heels in the hallway. They passed her room slowly, deliberately. And just before the sound vanished, a soft voice whispered, "Such a delicate thing." Clara pulled the covers over her head. The rain did not stop. It was on the second Sunday of Lady Verena's residence that Clara remembered the garden. She had stumbled across it as a child, wild, fragrant, and thick with her mother's laughter. Lady Alira had called it her rose sanctuary, hidden behind ivy-draped walls on the south side of the manor grounds. Clara hadn't been there since the funeral. A place once bursting with sunlight had become, in memory, a place that ached. But that morning, a sliver of sunlight broke through the gray clouds, and something in her stirred, perhaps defiance or perhaps grief shaped into courage. Clara donned her boots and a woolen cloak and slipped out while Verena was in the drawing room, sipping tea laced with some syrupy violet tincture. The southern path was overgrown now. Weeds clawed up through the cobbles. The wrought iron gate appeared through the trees like a forgotten monument. Clara paused. The gate was shut. Worse, chained, sealed with a rusted padlock that hadn't been there before. Ivy coiled around the bars like fingers in a desperate grasp. Through the gaps, Clara could just make out the wild tangle of rose bushes, thorned and unpruned. Once they had been pale pink and crimson, their scent drifting all the way to the east balconies. Now the garden looked like it had bled into itself. Vines curled like sleeping serpents. The air behind the gate was thick still. She reached for the gate, touched the cold metal, and heard footsteps behind her. Verena stood just beyond the path, her emerald cloak trailing over the mossy stones. Her face held its usual unreadable calm, but her voice carried the edge of something sharp. You shouldn't be here, Clara. I wanted to see the roses, Clara replied, not turning. Verina's heels crunched softly as she came closer. This place has grown wild, she said. Your mother kept it once, but now it serves no one. There are thorns beneath those petals, you know. Some wounds don't heal. Clara turned then. Why is it locked? Verena looked at her with an expression that might have been sadness, or something mimicking it. For your protection, dear. Some places are best left undisturbed. She laid a hand on Clara's shoulder. Now come. You'll catch cold. As they walked back to the manor, Clara dared to glance over her shoulder. The vines around the gate had begun to move. The west wing had changed. Once it had smelled of lavender and parchment, the place her mother used to read by the fire and hum to herself as she brushed out her hair. Now something darker clung to the air, something floral, yes, but sickly sweet overripe. Like petals left too long in a closed box. Clara wasn't allowed in there anymore. Verena had made it clear. This wing is private now. A woman needs her solitude. And Lord Arlen, distracted by council matters and whatever strange comfort Verena gave him, had simply nodded. But Clara was 11, and rules were invitations. That night, the moon was a silver coin tossed across the sky, and Clara followed its light like a thread. She crept barefoot down the velvet-lined corridor, silent as a ghost, her candle flickering in her grip. She passed her mother's old sewing room. Empty now, the smell of rosemary long gone. At the end of the hall stood Verena's chamber door, once Alira's. The handle was cold beneath Clara's fingers. She turned it slowly. Unlocked. The room inside was dimly lit, the fireplace reduced to coals, casting red breath across the walls. Strange shapes lined the shelves, bottles of dried herbs, dark glass vials, a bird's skull tied with ribbon. But what caught Clara's breath was the mirror. It stood in the far corner, nearly the height of the ceiling. The black velvet cloth that once covered it now lay bunched at its base. The frame was carved from something dark, too smooth to be wood, too dull to be metal. There were thorns etched into its surface, curling inward toward the glass like claws. And in that glass Verena stood, though not in the room. She was reflected there, her back to Clara, whispering words in a language the child didn't know. Her hands moved in slow, deliberate circles over the surface. The glass shimmered, rippled. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. Then, without warning, Verena turned. Only her reflection turned. The room itself was still empty. The real Verena was nowhere to be seen. Yet the eyes in the mirror met Clara's. The reflection smiled. And then came the voice, soft, almost affectionate. Curiosity is a curse, dear. Clara gasped and stumbled back. The door creaked, and the real Verena stepped through it, as if summoned. Her face was serene, but her eyes burned like banked coals. You shouldn't be in here, she said, her voice light, almost playful. It's so easy for children to get lost in the dark. Clara ran. Down the hall, through the cold corridors, until she was back in her own bed, pulling the blankets over her head as if they could block out what she had seen. Behind her closed door, the manor creaked. Somewhere, far down the west wing, a mirror whispered. The first to vanish was Mrs. Harrow, the laundress. Clara noticed the absence not because of the gossip. No one spoke of it, but because her favorite nightdress went missing and never returned. The fire-warmed scent of soap that once lingered in the linen cupboards faded. When Clara asked after Mrs. Harrow, the head housekeeper, Miss Goss, simply said, "She left suddenly. Family illness. That's all, child." Then went Liam, the stable boy who used to sneak Clara cubes of sugar when her writing lessons bored her. And then Tom, one of the footmen, a quiet man with a crooked nose who always tipped his cap to her in the morning. Each time, Verena had an answer before anyone asked the question. She eloped. He was caught stealing. He had a sick mother and no sense of duty. Too convenient. Too clean. And Clara noticed something else. They had all disobeyed her. Mrs. Harrow had once snapped at Verena for rearranging the household schedule. Liam had been scolded for letting Clara ride without supervision. Tom had refused to carry a box of strange-smelling herbs into the locked study. Now they were all gone. Whispers started, not from mouths but from the corners of rooms, from behind doors left too slightly ajar. At night, Clara heard sounds beneath the manor. The soft drag of something heavy across the floor, faint, muffled thuds like someone knocking from very far below. Once, when the wind howled through the upper gables, she thought she heard her name spoken, twice, like breath against a mirror. One evening, as the sun sank low behind gray clouds, Clara found the courage to ask her father. "Do you ever wonder where they've gone?" she said quietly at dinner, stirring untouched soup. Lord Arlen blinked as if pulled from some deep sleep. "Who?" "The servants. So many have left since she came." He paused, then smiled, but it was the tired smile of someone too weary to unravel a knot. "People move on, Clara. The manor is old. Times change." He reached for his wine without meeting her eyes. Verena sat beside him in her velvet dress, sipping calmly, her gaze unreadable. She did not speak, but she placed her hand gently over Arlen's, fingers resting on his wrist. He fell silent. Clara pushed her chair back and left the table. She wandered to the rose garden gate again. Still chained. But this time, a single red rose bloomed among the thorns. Its petals were fresh, but its stem was streaked with something darker, something that looked like blood. And Clara thought, suddenly and terribly, that she understood. The garden wasn't dying. It was feeding. The rose had not been there the day before. Of that, Clara was certain. She had memorized every tangle of vine, every darkened bloom in that cursed garden. But now a single flower, deep red and full, bowed gently toward her from between the iron bars. It was beautiful in the way of things that are not quite right, like a smile that hides teeth, or a lullaby sung just slightly out of tune. She hesitated only a moment before reaching through the bars. The thorns tore a thin line across her wrist, sharp and eager. But her fingers brushed something nestled at the base of the bloom, a charm. Silver, shaped like a rose, but encased in thorn vines that twisted around its petals. Cool to the touch, but not cold. It pulsed faintly in her palm, like a heartbeat wrapped in metal. She jerked back, clutching it, blood dripping from her arm. The garden fell silent. That night, Clara hid the charm beneath her pillow, unsure why she hadn't told anyone. Not that there was anyone left to tell. The servants still there walked stiffly through the halls, eyes a little too wide, mouths set a little too tightly. Even Miss Goss had grown pale and quiet. It was as if the manor itself was holding its breath. When she fell asleep, her dreams opened like a door. She stood once more in the rose garden, but it was alive, green and gold with sunlight, the air rich with the perfume of healthy bloom. Birds sang. Bees drifted lazily between the petals. And there, her mother. Lady Alira stood among the roses in a gown the color of rain clouds, her hands outstretched. Her eyes were filled with urgency. She said something. Clara couldn't hear the words. They came as wind, as rustling leaves, but the feeling in her chest was unmistakable. Warning. Then the sky darkened. The garden twisted. Vines blackened and grew like snakes, thorns stretching longer, sharper. Alira screamed, but no sound came, and was pulled into the earth, swallowed beneath petals dripping red. Clara woke gasping, clutching the charm. There was a smear of dirt on her hands. And something far worse, a thorn embedded in her palm. She yanked it out with trembling fingers. No blood, only a strange black sap that vanished into her skin. From somewhere down the corridor, the mirror in Verena's room whispered again. Words she still couldn't understand, but they pressed against her thoughts like claws trying to get in. Clara stared out the window toward the garden. The charm gleamed faintly beneath the moonlight. Whatever lay behind the gate had once been hers. But now it belonged to something else. The cellar door groaned as Clara pulled it open. No one came down here anymore. Not since the wine cellar had been moved and the old root storage left to dust and spiders. But the charm burned warm against her chest, strung now on a leather cord she had tied herself, and something deep within whispered, "Look below." She crept down the stone steps with only a flickering candle and her courage, the air growing colder with each step. The smell of damp wood and old earth thickened, and cobwebs brushed her cheeks like ghostly fingers. The cellar was vast, carved directly into the hillside beneath the manor. Barrels, crates, and broken furniture loomed like skeletal shapes in the dark. Clara moved carefully, eyes scanning for what, she wasn't sure. Until she saw it. A loose stone in the wall, low to the floor. Discolored and cracked at the edges, as though it had been shifted many times before. She set her candle down and pried it free. Behind it, wrapped in brittle oilcloth, was a leather-bound book, old, water-stained, and tied with faded ribbon. Her mother's initials, Yem, were scorched into the cover. Clara sat on the cellar floor, the candlelight trembling as if nervous, and opened the journal. The writing was unmistakably Alira's. Neat, elegant, with occasional ink blotches where the pen had trembled. The early pages were filled with gardening notes and pressed flowers, smiling entries about Clara's first steps in the garden, her favorite colors, which birds sang in summer. Then the tone shifted. There is a darkness beneath Verina's beauty. She arrived in town under a different name, Verena Blackthorn. I remember the name from the Northern Coven's exile records. Blood binding. Mira writes. Soul entrapment. She envies the garden, not for its beauty, but for what it holds. The roses were not just flowers. They were protectors. I wove charms into their roots. If I fall, Clara must find them. Clara turned the page with shaking fingers. Verena is here. I feel her in the mirrors. She wants the child. She wants the bloodline. She knows. If you find this, Clara, wear the charm. It is part of me. It will wake what sleeps. But beware, the garden must be reclaimed before the blood moon, or she will offer you to the thorns. The candle flickered violently. Somewhere above, a door creaked. Clara clutched the journal to her chest and fled up the stairs, her breath coming fast and shallow. She knew now why Verena had locked the garden, and why she had married Clara's father. It wasn't love. It was inheritance. The blood moon rose like a burning eye over the treetops. Clara watched it from her window, the charm cold and silent against her chest. The journal lay open on her lap, pages trembling with every beat of her heart. The words were no longer warnings, they were instructions. She had until midnight. Downstairs, the manor hummed with unnatural stillness. The clocks had all stopped ticking. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Verena had begun her preparations. Clara crept from her room in silence, dressed in black, her boots soft on the carpeted halls. In one hand, she held her mother's journal. In the other, a bundle of dried rose petals she had taken from Alira's old Bible. The charm swung around her neck, pulsing faintly now, like it had awakened from a long slumber. She made her way toward the garden gate. But Verena was already there. Clad in a flowing gown the color of storm clouds, she stood before the chained gate, one hand outstretched. Her eyes shimmered silver beneath the moonlight. The lock had dissolved, melted, as though touched by acid, and the gate creaked open at her presence. The garden had come alive. Roses bloomed impossibly fast, thorn vines slithering along the ground like vipers. The air shimmered with a faint red mist. The charm around Clara's neck burned hot. Verena turned, smiling softly. You're just in time, my sweet. Clara took a step back. You killed them. The servants. My mother. Verena sighed as if disappointed. You still don't understand, do you? I don't kill, Clara. I transform. I bind. I preserve. Her fingers curled like claws. Alira tried to stop me, and now she lives in every thorn you see. She should be proud. Her sacrifice feeds the bloom. The garden vines reached for Clara's feet. She ran, but the thorns snared her ankles like teeth. She fell, and the journal scattered into the soil. Verena's shadow loomed, her fingers glowing with dark light. Your blood is old, child, the last of your mother's line. And when it touches root, I will rise forever. Clara screamed, and the charm flared with white fire. The vines recoiled. Verena staggered back, snarling. And then a voice, gentle and sorrowful, rose from the roses. Clara, her mother. From the heart of the garden, a figure emerged, woven from petals, light, and memory. Lady Alira, no longer whole, but powerful in her sorrow. The vines paused. The entire garden seemed to hesitate. Alira raised her hand, and every rose turned toward Verena. You broke the pact, Alira said, voice like wind through leaves. You touched my child. Verena screamed, casting bolts of shadow and flame, but the roses swallowed them, drinking the darkness. Clara, rising on shaking legs, held the charm high. The thorns surged, not at her, but at Verena. They wrapped around the witch's limbs, yanking her downward, into the earth that once refused her. She shrieked, her form unraveling like mist under fire. No, I cannot die. I am rooted in blood. The roses answered with silence. And then she was gone. The garden breathed. Morning came slowly. Soft golden light poured through the high windows of Greystone Manor, touching the dusty tapestries and fading the long-held shadows. For the first time in weeks, perhaps longer, the halls did not creak with hidden whispers, and the mirrors reflected only what stood before them. Clara stood at the edge of the rose garden, barefoot, the dew soaking her hem. Where chaos had raged the night before, now there was calm. The garden was transformed, not tamed but healed. Roses bloomed in every shade of memory. Crimson like her mother's favorite dress, blush pink like Clara's cheeks in spring, white like the soft pages of Alira's journal. The vines no longer writhed. They curled gently around the stone arches and iron fences like guardians who could finally rest. The charm still hung around Clara's neck, dull now, its glow extinguished. But when she touched it, it was warm, not with magic, but with presence. She would never again see her mother's face, yet she felt her everywhere. In the roots, in the wind, in the scent of the flowers that now opened gladly to the sun. She walked the gravel path slowly, reverently. No trace of Verena remained. Not in the soil, not in the mirrors, not even in the locked west wing, which now stood empty and cold. The servants, those who remained, whispered of strange dreams and restful sleep. Miss Goss had returned to her usual stern bustle, and the kitchen smelled of cinnamon again. Lord Arlen remained distant, as if waking from a long fever. He spoke little of Verena, and even less of what had happened. But he watched Clara now with quiet awe, as though seeing her not as a girl, but as something newly born. That afternoon, Clara took a pair of garden shears from the shed. She snipped a single perfect rose, deep red, the same shade that had first lured her to the gate. She placed it in a crystal vase on her mother's old writing desk, beneath a sunlit window. The manor no longer felt haunted. It felt like hers. As night fell and the stars bled into the sky, Clara stood at her window once more. The rose garden swayed gently in the wind, alive and whispering. A legacy reclaimed, a curse undone. And beneath the moonlight, for the first time in what felt like years, she smiled.